Okay, I think we've reached the time to introduce our keynote speaker. So we're very fortunate to have today Daniel Polsky as our keynote speaker. Dr. Polsky is a Bloomberg Distinguished Professor of Health Policy and Economics at Johns Hopkins University. Prior to joining Hopkins, this past year, I believe it was, right, just recently, he was at University of Pennsylvania. He was the executive director of the Leonard Davis Institute of Health Economics, and he was a professor at both the Perelman School of Medicine and the Wharton School of Business. He has many distinctions and honors, including being a member of the National Academy of Medicine. He serves on the Congressional Budget Office's Board of Health Advisors, on the National Academy of Science, Engineering, and Medicine's Health and Medicine Committee. He was formerly on the President's Council of Economic Advisors as a senior economist in the 2007-2008 timeframe. Also involved as an editor, assistant editor at numerous journals, including Health Economics, Health Services Research, Medical Care Research and Review. So we're very fortunate to have him here today. Dr. Polsky.
Works. Well, thank you so much for that introduction and for having me here today. It's really my great honor to have a chance to speak with you and welcome you all here at the beginning of the 13th edition of this conference. And I'm going to deliver some thoughts on closing the gap between research and policy. Thank you to the organizing committee for inviting me. This conference has a very special place in my heart. Back in 1995, I was still a graduate student at the University of Pennsylvania in the Department of Economics. I gave my very first academic presentation at the very first conference of this group. It was, so, coming back, I remember, I felt like it was in a basement of some hospital or something. I don't know if anyone was there. It was like kind of grungy, you know? But I think the keynote or something was like Michael Dukakis. So I don't know, you know, you can estimate yourself like how we're doing with the new invites for keynote speakers. So at the time, it was called the International Conference on Health Policy Research. So the name changed a little bit, but the acronym still is like, you know, hard for me to get my head around. So the title of my talk was Confidence Intervals for Cost-Effectiveness Ratios, a comparison of 4 methods. I was very nervous. So 25 years later, the title of my talk has changed, but I'm still a little nervous. So today, as I said, I'm going to talk about closing the gap between research and policy, particularly because I've spent a good bit of my time in the early part of my career trying to find better ways to express uncertainty around cost-effectiveness ratios. But I grew frustrated that the cost-effective treatments I studied, mostly in mental health and substance abuse, were not being adopted, while so many low-value treatments, particularly in cancer and cardiovascular disease, were being adopted and rapidly diffused throughout the healthcare system. I set out on a journey to understand this gap between research and policy and see how I could contribute to building bridges. However, I soon learned that there are no bridges that span the Grand Canyon. The gap between research and policy remains vast. So here's some statistics, but you know, like take them with a grain of salt, like all statistics, all right? So someone estimated that less than $1 out of every 100 of government spending is backed by even the most basic evidence that the money is being spent wisely. In health policy, situation can be viewed as potentially worse than that. It's estimated that $1 of government spending is devoted to evaluating whether the other $999 are spent wisely. Taxpayers and voters want government to operate effectively and efficiently, and this depends on good information. And we see private enterprise is often relatively better informed. Some businesses are very heavily data-driven. Even medicine is better informed. In medicine, what's that statistic? That half of treatments have an evidence base, which, the glass is half full or half empty. The other half doesn't really have an evidence base for the clinical evidence. But in health policy, that number is substantially worse. So on the other side of that canyon is a thriving research enterprise devoted to health policy. The number of journals and publications continue to expand, funding at historic levels. PCORI just got funded for another 10 years. I was going to come up here and just say, I got funding for another 10 years so I could get a round of applause, but sadly I didn't. And data opportunities and computational capacity are expanding exponentially. Yet health policy research is changing in ways that offer opportunities to have an impact on policy in there are just new opportunities out there. They're particularly driven by a sense of urgency among policymakers and researchers alike that policy can improve if we have a better sense of what works and what does not work. In fact, Congress passed a new law in 2019. It was passed unanimously. It's called the Foundations for Evidence-Based Policymaking Act. The law makes it easier to securely use data government already collects so it can better inform policy. The law provides a foundation. It's not transformative, but the hope is it could lead to a cultural shift within departments and agencies where rigorous evaluation matters more in designing and funding programs. The second point here is the era of big data and highly complex data sets clearly upon us now. The talk of artificial intelligence transforming industries has made its way to healthcare. The opportunities to leverage genomic information, electronic health records, open data, the state and local levels, they're expanding every day. While the opportunities seem to be everywhere, it remains a challenge to identify the opportunities where data can be best leveraged to shape the future. I thought I'd give a plug to the theme of leveraging data to shape the future, so just had to get that in there. Good job, guys. I like the theme. Third, the expansion of web and mobile-based technologies for gathering data, communicating with patients and providers, and sharing information with the public creates new domains for how data can shape policy and practice. So fourth, there's a recognition of the value in connecting research with the community and all the relevant stakeholders in the public and private sectors at the earliest stages of research and development. I see funders, such as PCORI, making these configurations of research teams a requirement, and I see them providing the funds to make these teams function appropriately. Finally, social media and data visualization offer new ways to communicate complex findings to new audiences so that they can be more easily understood. We have yet to fully tap these opportunities. So for this group dedicated to health policy statistics, I'm going to take this opportunity to emphasize the critical role of statistical research to allow for evidence-based policy. You probably know these quite well. Here I'll give 3 points to emphasize to this group. One is statistical research follows a systematic and rule-governed process. It guards against self-deception or following the crowd, which we often see in policymaking. 2, its disinterested approach is a more dependable and defensible guide than informed hunches, analogies, or personal experience. 3, methods and models of prediction and causal inference help describe what is likely to happen or what did happen. This type of work is critical in accountable political systems. So I also want to remind you all that robust health policy evidence does make a difference in people's lives when used for policy. I know this is a motivating factor for why so many of you are in this field. But unfortunately, the research must cross into policy for it to really make that difference. When it does, research can really help. It can help ensure the greatest and most equitable population health gains. It increases the likelihood that successful programs and policies are the ones that get implemented. And it contributes to a more efficient use of resources. Finally, I'll just say, statisticians provide a key element of what policymakers want when engaging with researchers. They're the keystone for trust, rigor, and tested methods. However, statistics can be very quickly overwhelm a policy or practitioner audience. It can even tune them out from bottom line conclusions. You know, when I got online to find some meme or something, there were like hundreds of these. So they want rigorous and tested methods, but they really don't want to hear about them. So this is a healthy tension that must be managed, and I'm going to try to touch on that a little bit as I move forward with my talk. So here's my way of kind of categorizing this gap between research and policymakers. Statistical researchers are aiming to be scientific in their approach, am I right? Yes. Policymakers are more colloquial. They aim for plain English in their approach. Researchers aim to be rigorous, model-driven, will only feel comfortable making conclusions that they feel are proven. Policymakers, they're looking for reasonable arguments that are policy relevant. Finally, to make a strong conclusion, researchers will still couch their statements with caveats and qualifications and take care not to overstate their findings, while policymakers they're just looking for a clear message. So in a nutshell, this represents the gap. I'd like to dig in a bit so you'll see this kind of outline of these three sources of tension come up again. But the overall objectives here is, one of them, I want to share my experiences and lessons learned, so you too might think differently about your work, the way my experiences have shaped mine. Cite examples and insights from others to offer strategies for increasing policy impact to your work, and offer some recommendations to facilitate that impact. So my bio is given, so I'm not going to get too much into this, but I'm really much more of a researcher than a policy maven, but just kind of touching on this gives you some sense of where I'm coming from the way I've tried to connect with policy. So I was trained as an economist in an economics department, but my first appointment was in a school of medicine. So my research from its very start was shaped in this very applied environment. But still, you know, I was focused on what it took to get tenure. Soon after getting tenure, I took a sabbatical for a year and went to Washington as the end of the Bush administration, and I spent a year at the Council of Economic Advisors. So I really got just kind of deep into what it was like to be in the thick of a policy environment and as a researcher trying to inform policy. And that experience really changed my research focus. I felt like I made a shift from one where I was looking to write for an audience of researchers to an audience that was really using research. A couple years later, I became the executive director of the Leonard Davis Institute of Health Economics. It's more of like a glue organization across all the schools at the University of Pennsylvania to bring research together that are focused on improving the healthcare system. When I joined that role, I really invested heavily in research translation and policy engagement to better connect researchers at Penn with health policy at the state and national level. I can touch on that experience as I go forward in this talk. In the past year, I've transitioned to Johns Hopkins University, where I have appointments in the Bloomberg School of Public Health and the Carey Business School. In this new position, I'll have more opportunities to connect research with policy and practice, so I'm very excited about what's ahead and try to apply some of the lessons learned as I move forward. And I'll be closer to Washington to make those connections that I often make in Washington. So going forward, I'll reflect on my experiences to address these three categories of the gap between healthcare research and health policy. So I'll put these tensions here as numbers versus evidence, rigor versus relevance, and relevance, and caveats versus a clear message. So first, this idea of numbers versus evidence, and really, when it was a long time ago, and I came home from Washington, I said, you know what, it just seems that numbers matter more than evidence. So I was kind of like down on, my ability to really use research to impact policy. So it was a frustration, but the frustration was on two sides because, that time leading up to my time in Washington, I do my research, get it published, but, no one was paying attention to it. But I see what works does not get implemented and what gets implemented does not work. And, that frustration was there even before I went to Washington. And then there I was sitting at my little office there near the White House. And I'd get called and asked just for numbers to help sell a policy, to contribute to assessing policy option, rather than just trying to do some policy analysis and read all the reports and evidence. It was more like, okay, listen, I got a bill that has prevention in it. We're going to expand prevention, and I know it saves money. And it's going to make everyone's life better. So I just need that number that shows how much money it's going to save and how many lives get improved from that. And there's a lot of, sometimes it works, not all the time. And I was just asked for one big number that summarized it all that this congressman was going to go sell for his bill. I tried to engage in some argument how the evidence is really much more of a mixed story. It didn't take long for him to look somewhere else to get the numbers that he was looking for. Did I get them? I guess the point there is that, I lost my seat at the table. And so the question I would ask myself is it a contribution to evidence-based policy to provide the numbers? And maybe I should just go back to my research. How do I make these things meet? So, I went back with that, and I have a more sophisticated way of thinking about it than just thinking, numbers matter and evidence and research doesn't matter. So here are my lessons about this point. If research findings are used to support a cognitive bias, consider research that influences those biases. All right, so people have a proclivity to ignore evidence that contradicts their preconceived notions, confirmation bias. They may assess the frequency of an event by the ease with which instances are brought to mind, availability bias. They may be overly cautious and have loss aversion. These are all forms of cognitive bias. The most influential aspect of research for policy is hard to identify because it can inform research in mysterious ways. When it is simply used as an instrument for policy, it is easier to observe, but may be much less common. And I think I was out there thinking there was just this one study that would support that one policy, it would get implemented, and it would just be so obvious, and the tides would turn, and the seas would part. I went back, and there's a framing of this from the 1970s by Weiss that defines instrumental use and conceptual use of research. Instrumental use of research is when research informs a specific policy decision. Conceptual use of research is research that informs thinking about issues rather than dictating a particular program or practice. This can be like research that helps with setting the agenda for what's important, framing the importance of policy problems, providing context for understanding issues. Conceptual influence of research goes unacknowledged or undervalued by policymakers, practitioners, researchers, and sometimes even people evaluating you for promotion. It may even be what informs the strongly held views that demand those numbers and maybe lead to some of these biases, or maybe this is the type of evidence that can kind of dislodge those biases rather than this number, this finding, that finding. So a recent example of this issue that something I pay close attention to is this issue of surprise billing. It generated a law, it almost generated a law addressing this insidious issue where you go to a hospital that's in your network, when you have insurance, and then you get treated by ED docs or anesthesiologists that aren't in network, and you get these huge bills that come in. Has anyone ever gotten a big surprise bill? It happens like 15, 20% of ED visits. But once that kind of number of how frequent these things occur and how much it can cost came out from these researchers at Yale, it really put this issue on the table in a way it hadn't before. And one of the reasons that was the case is they worked very closely with Margot Sanger-Katz, who's a columnist at the New York Times, who was able to display the results there. And that kind of combination of very descriptive research, bringing out the magnitude of an issue and communicating it very, very elegantly, really put this on the table. Unfortunately, it got like nixed by a single senator at the last minute, but that's the way it goes sometimes. So the second lesson from this numbers versus evidence thing is there's a need to understand the complex system in which policy is developed. Policymakers are engaged in an interactive social process that assembles, interprets, argues over science, whether it's relevant to the policy choice at hand, and sometimes that single senator that's in the pocket of somebody just nixes a policy at the last minute. Evidence-based policy is an approach to policy that helps people make well-informed decisions about policies, programs, and projects by putting the best available evidence from research at the heart of the policy development and implementation process. But it's an integration of experience and judgment with the best evidence from systematic research that can shape policy. It's rare that any single research specifically leads to a policy being developed or enacted. In addition, policymakers need a much wider range of information sources than just research evidence. The perspectives of the legislative staff can be instrumental. Constituents, politics, personal events can have an outsized influence. Researchers should understand this process. It can be discouraging and disillusioning to view research as not used in policy decisions when financial influences and constituent demands seem to rule the day. So let me just quickly review these policy steps, and in each step, evidence and research is critical. One is understand arising needs for new policies. Two, inform development of new policy options. Then it moves on to appraise the likely effects of policy options, evaluating effects to redirect towards intended outcomes, policy objectives, and strategic directions. And then influencing others when competing priorities are at play. It's this last step that led to my conclusion that numbers matter more than evidence. It was at this point in the policy process that evidence was needed to support those policy arguments. I was unaware of all the steps that preceded that step that I was a part of. And this third lesson, I just will throw in there, is they want numbers, make them good numbers. Right? Solid descriptive work is of great value. It's valuable, it's often underappreciated in academic circles. Statistics should ensure rigorous data collection. There's a role for advocating for a strong census infrastructure, and this is really also critical to your education that you do, and making sure this is impressed upon your students. So in these three categories here, the second one is rigor versus relevance. So here's my little schematic. So on the left here, we have technically rigorous, and on the right, there's policy relevant. And there is an overlap there, and that overlap is where the win-win is. For me, this focus on technically rigorous at the expense of policy relevance, that part that doesn't overlap, was really driven by the incentives around tenure. The only thing relevant to me at some point in my early career was what was relevant for what I had to do to get tenure. And that often does not overlap with that circle of policy relevance, unfortunately. Later in my career, after tenure and all that stuff, as a leader of the Leonard Davis Institute at Penn, I wanted the organization to have greater policy impact. But the organization was made up of faculty needing to get tenure and/or faculty that maybe got promoted, but they were still very much tied to their scholarly networks and their scholarly audiences. So when I tried to push for more policy, I found that overlap between these two circles to be fairly small. And the other side of that, so that's from the perspective of the researcher sitting in an academic environment. On the other side of this schematic are policymakers who are looking to make the best decisions they can with the information at hand and the time they have allotted and the resources they have available. So there is an overlap with technically rigorous because science that is viewed by other policymakers as valid and sound can help them make strong policy arguments. And my lesson here, which I'll get into in the next slide, has been to embrace cultural differences that exist, these barriers that exist in academic environments and in policy environments, and just find the win-win and try to expand that area where these two circles overlap. So I'm just going to review some of these barriers as misaligned incentives. The researchers need to get promoted, they need to get grants or whatever type of incentives they're under for success as an academic. Well, the incentives for a policymaker might be to get reelected or do what's best for their constituents. Ineffective communication approaches. The researchers are busy publishing in journals which are often not written for policy audiences. And then those that are translating that evidence often have agendas in mind. Third, they're just different time horizons. This one comes up all the time. Researchers want evidence for something their cycles are extremely short. For me, a deadline is 2 years from now, which is unheard of in the policy world. Available resources can be a real constraint here, and the availability of data. And there's also just a real gap of mistrust and cultural differences between these groups that just, often don't connect until they need to or have some need, and then they want that need met, but really don't understand the other side. So there are facilitators too. These facilitators include easy access to relevant and useful research, frequent opportunities. So when we see success, when we see that overlap, these things are in place. But that overlap doesn't necessarily have, we don't always find it. There's some places we find it a lot, but in other places it's hard to find. The second one, frequent opportunities for interactions between researchers and policymakers, and working in organizations receptive to this interaction. So is government receptive to research and evidence-based policymakers, and is the university receptive to policy research? So some of the lessons here is that these barriers may be hard to move. For example, policymakers think of research as bias, as part of their and it's part of their political persuasion process, everything they see from that political lens. Or researchers view research as objective. So my view is we embrace these cultural differences that generate barriers and just look for the win-win, look for that overlap. Focus on facilitators to expand the areas of opportunities. So I'm going to go quickly through each of these. The first one is convene. Cultivate relationships, develop systems for timely interaction, collaboration, and promoting trust-based interactions. A growing interface between policymakers and researchers could facilitate use of research evidence by bringing about a joint language, more mutual understanding of each other's norms, values, and everyday realities. Second one is educate. Trust can be nurtured by growing the understanding of the differences in incentives, timing, values, and resources. We're not really there to change those differences, but develop an understanding of them. And the third is around communication. I think, sometime we just might need to outsource that communication. Don't just rely on journal articles. Researchers only have so much bandwidth for putting their findings into the context that is most relevant for policymakers. And policymakers are always demanding, I want to see your findings. How does that apply in my context? Which often isn't the question you get from your journal reviewers. So this might be best done by others. The important point here is that establishing contextual relevance increases the likelihood that evidence is valued. Those with a comparative advantage in these skills may be better suited to bridge the gap between research and policy. Fortunately, this requires resources that aren't always available. But I'll get to that a little bit more later. So the third kind of category here is caveats versus clear message. So here's a very clear message. Remember this from Theranos, this tagline, "One tiny drop changes everything." So I won't go through this story, as I imagine you've heard it before, but the message made billions with really no evidence and no research behind it. At least it made billions at a point in time. But you could see when the hype was up there about Theranos that a clear message can go a long way. But you can't ignore the caveats, limitations, and qualifications, as those billions will be lost and you may end up in jail. So the example I came across my own example when working at the Council of Economic Advisors was much less dramatic. But I was called by the speechwriter for George Bush to fact check a number. He said, he's going on stage in 3 hours. And at the time, the White House was defending, yes, a veto on children's health insurance. So I was working against children's health insurance. Nevertheless, the argument was being made was that this policy would support insurance for those making up to $80,000. So this number, $80,000, it was only true in a couple of states and for only a few families. So the speechwriter wanted to know if he could drop those qualifications, like in these 3 states and for these types of families. And he said, could you imagine George Bush saying all those sentences? And, I still kind of regret this today, but I said, use the number, whatever. And, it's a tough call sometime. When do you go with the caveats and when do you drop the caveats? I think it was all that pressure, he's going on stage. I couldn't imagine him saying it, but I still think I shouldn't have said yes. But I'm just leveling with you guys. So artificial intelligence and the potential for replicating human bias through artificial intelligence presents a challenge for the field. Everyone wants to apply AI free from even thinking about the data generating process. On the other hand, if all we do is think about that process, we may never begin to capitalize on the enormous power of emerging applications of rapidly developing methods. The applications could be developed without the experts, just as in the case of Theranos. So sometimes it's important to be at the table. So my lesson here is don't lose the forest from the trees, or don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, something like that. But this is the one I struggle over the most, and I still struggle over. Really, there's no right answer here. An example I'll give. Transparency of randomized designs offers a very clear message. In my field, health insurance, the RAN health insurance experiment from the 70s, it's still cited today. It randomly assigned families to different levels of healthcare cost sharing. It found those responsible for more of the cost of care used far less of it, and with no short-term adverse outcomes. More recently, Random Access to Oregon's Medicaid program provided an opportunity to experimentally access Medicaid coverage. The findings from this study find increased access to care, diminished financial hardship, and reduced rates of depression from gaining insurance in Medicaid. But the lack of statistically significant findings with respect to improvements in other health outcomes have been pointed by some as evidence that Medicaid should be thrown out entirely. Clear messages of randomization are very powerful. The problem I see here is that randomization for healthcare policy is often not possible and frequently unethical. When it is possible, it's hard to maintain politically. For example, CMMI evaluations are generally not randomized and rely on voluntary participation. When randomized by market, it can be hard to maintain politically. So how to build trust with non-randomized studies when randomization is rare and challenging? There was a recent randomized employer wellness program that found no improvements in costs, no reduction in costs, no changes in outcomes from an evidence-based wellness program, which was quite a difference from many of the lower quality studies that were more observational that showed cost savings. And so, if there are these low quality studies out there that are based on observational data, and we need observational data to make some of these policy claims, where do we find that balance? But we can't lose sight of the caveats. They're important. We don't want to run away with conclusions that are not supported by design. And I think it's really imperative of the people in this room to think quite carefully about making sure we don't run away with conclusions that aren't supported by design. So the other place around caveats and a clear message is uncertainty. So I like a positive example here of just kind of dropping the uncertainty as a congressional budget office. They don't use confidence intervals. Sometimes they come up with these numbers with these big fancy models, and clearly there's a lot of uncertainty around all the parameters that go into those models. But they say, this is going to cost X. It has a huge policy influence, and CBO is a great example of really aggregating research to impact policy. And it's really some of the most impactful ways that research impacts policy. And they don't use caveats and confidence intervals. And they're always wrong. But, they're as close as we can get. Weather cones, on the other hand, are great depictions of uncertainty until they're not. And I won't comment further on that slide. So I'm going to my last section here is to just throw out some recommendations. These are not new recommendations. I didn't make all these up, but it's a good way to summarize some of my thoughts, and for some of the young faculty here, it might be new to them. So think about the type of impact you want to have with your work. Be courageous, ask the right questions, try to affect the conversation. And so, one thought here is use statistics to not only evaluate whether the data are sufficient to answer the question that is asked, an important role of statisticians, but to use statistics to expand the set of questions that can be answerable with the data available, and advocate for rigorous data collection and census infrastructure. Remain rigorous in quantifying uncertainty, but pursue innovative approaches for communicating that uncertainty without using a Sharpie pen. Credibility is critical. It requires rigor and tested methods. Keep in mind that there's a reliance on the reputation of the source. The policymakers can't really evaluate the science oftentimes and rely on the reputation of the source as their way to kind of, separate the wheat from the chaff. So credibility is critical. But access is important too. But if you try to find the balance to maintain your access without giving up on your credibility. Relevance, timely, topical. Think of the policy implications. Think of how best to put your results in the proper context. Clarity. Audience needs to be able to understand your research once they have access to it. Research your audience. Tailor your message accordingly. So my theory here is this pipeline model. If communication's not your thing, focus on your comparative advantage, but work on the handoff. There are intermediaries that can translate that message for you. For example, media, right? they're the writers, they're journalists, you're statisticians. They have a comparative advantage in communicating your findings, but just take that extra step that you might not get credit for on your CV necessarily. But focus on your comparative advantage, but hand off and take that extra step. But to really expand this overlap between technical rigor and policy relevance, it requires leadership. So here's some recommendations for leadership. These aren't really new, but the measurement of service and impact for promotion would help move away from standard measures of productivity connected to publications and the quality and status of those journals. Maybe solicit letters from outside academia for particular researchers that are focused on this gap between research and policy. Funding for communication, translation, and convening are critical to bridging this gap. It's not cheap to build all this extra stuff, and the funder from Pecori was shaking his head. He knows it's not cheap. Address the timing gap between relevance and the time for a project to be completed. So I'll close with this, and I guess it says walk a mile in a policymaker's shoes. Researchers seek to increase the use of research in decision-making. They see evidence of things that don't work, but they're still used in practice. They find things work better, but they don't get adopted. It's frustrating. And then sometimes you do this work, you think it's really important and relevant, and it just kind of, it's on to the next thing. Decision makers seek to make wiser decisions. To what extent, in what ways, and under what conditions can social research help with decision making? They encounter research, however, that's not written for them or communicated to their needs, and they kind of fall away as well. So what I encourage you to do is take the perspective of the decision maker and ask, how can public policy making be improved? And what role can research play? What role can I play in that improvement? Thank you very much. I think we have time for questions. If anyone has questions, there's a microphone up here. Or chat or thoughts.
So I think
do we have time for it?
Yeah, we have time. So if you have questions, please come up to the mic. I don't see Tom lying.
Hey, good to see you.
It's a wonderful excuse for a dumb question to say someone had to start the questions, which is true. So there's a point that I was sitting here thinking about this point through most of your talk, and it turns out you mentioned it on the last point on your slide for junior researchers, but I think still want to ask a question about it. And so you're kind of describing an ecosystem that consists of the researcher, us, and the policymaker, senator, whoever. And I've sort of learned a view of the world that's somewhat different, which puts much more of an emphasis on the series of different intermediaries between the person who does the academic, let's not say academic, but rigorous research, and the people who write bills and maybe vote on them. And it involves people like from our side, maybe the advocacy organizations, people like Kaiser Health News or Commonwealth Fund or whatever. And on the other side, the people who really write the bills who are, the sort of second best graduates from undergraduate programs that we struggle to teach statistics to, and to do things for their representatives. And so that would, I think, mean different things for the things that we have to learn to do than would be the concept that's suggested by your sort of two-player model of the world. So could you comment on all of that?
I thank you so much for that, because when I saw too some of the workshops and the people here, I mean, they're people who are researchers that sit in like Treasury or all these different agencies as well, and including think tanks and these kind of influencers or translators, I would say. And so I was like, thinking I needed to adjust my slide, but thank you for being the plant in my audience to bring out that really important point. And I'll just add that I think it's still, if you're talking to someone just like you that maybe went to the same graduate program, but they're sitting in an agency, and you're sitting in because you teach statistics, you sit in a university or something, it's still important to understand that perspective because they're accountable to the policymakers. And so even though you speak the same language, you're still kind of subjected to different sets of incentives and culture. So that's what I'll say on that, but I take your point. I think it's an excellent point.
Arlene Ash, University of Massachusetts Medical School. You talked around this, but I don't think you actually said it. And it has to do with addressing this difference in time frame. I think that researchers can address the problem that it takes them a long time to get a good answer by thinking very carefully about what the policymakers are going to be looking at in a couple of years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's ideal, right?
But a lot of this stuff shouldn't take us by surprise.
But there's also a lot of researchers that are thinking about doing a 2-year research project now on something that's interesting now. I see that, that happen a little too often. But thinking ahead is a good way to do it. But there are plenty of opportunity. I've seen some places do this where they have they have these hackathons, stay up all night, where they do these kind of write a policy paper-thon where everyone comes together and tries to just put everything aside to get out a piece that is very timely and relevant. So I think there are creative ways to kind of bridge that timing gap. I think for me, I find it's important to be clear up front that whereas a leader of an organization saying the faculty just aren't going to deliver, that you might be better off going to the intermediary shop or a consultant that can put in 30 people to answer a question very quickly. It might not be the academics that are thinking on different timelines. I think it's important to, if you're in those conversations, to find the win-wins. If you have to deliver in a timely way, if it's not there for you, maybe that's not the right opportunity.
Tom Bellin from UCLA and former co-chair of this conference with Arlene, and so welcome back to the ICHPS. I really enjoyed that anecdote. So on Santa Monica Boulevard in West LA, there's a billboard that has a reader board running tally of what it says, smoking deaths this year, and it's not uncommon when you're sitting at a red light for the tally to increase, and it's a running tally that gets into the hundreds of thousands by the end of the year. But then it was, I learned from someone who was involved in the tobacco litigation that what gets counted as a smoking death includes, for example, if a smoker died in a car crash not related to smoking while they were driving, that counts as a smoking death. Does that cross the line in terms of what you would say in terms of what, in your framing of policy on the instrumental versus conceptual frameworks of policy? Does that let go of too many caveats and qualifications for your case? And if so, what should be done about it?
So, the one that always comes up for me is it's like what is it for quality of patient safety, right? To err is human, that, it's like a plane crashing every day. That's how many people die from errors. And if you go into that evidence, you realize that has a similar kind of sketchy situation, but that changed everything. You go to the IOM, NAM, they still talk about that study as the study that changed everything. So, I think it's an individual's call. I don't think there's a police about this, because I think that the question is some type of balance between getting a seat at the table and being part of the process, and holding on to your credibility. And I think everyone has to find their own space in that. But in thinking about that part, I really, struggled with that even as I wrote it and as I talked about it. But I guess that's how I see it.
Hi, I'm Emily Hadley. I'm from RTI International. Thanks so much for speaking today. I really enjoyed your presentation. My question is related to your section on caveats, and particularly an instance that I've experienced, and you might have as well, where you're in the room with a policymaker, and the policymaker thinks that their view on their issue is aligned with yours, but they haven't decided for sure what they're going to do yet. And so they're asking you, what would you do? And the challenge as a statistician is knowing, well, there are all of these caveats, and it's based on this sample, and there's a lot of limitations. And how do you, in that moment, do you respond with what you would do? Do you give the limitations? Like, how have you approached that situation if you've been there?
I think it's, so when we were trained at the Council of Economic Advisors, you said, well, you're the economist at the table, so speak up when it's relevant to your training. Otherwise, there's a lot of other things that are at play. I think as a researcher, I want to speak up when it's within my realm to speak up. But sometimes I say, well, let me tell you what I would do as a voter or as a citizen, which often is not necessarily, because it kind of steps out of my knowledge of research, but kind of brings in values and a whole set of other things that are more complicated. But I've given those opinions, and that it's somewhat informed by my expertise, but it's mostly as a voter. But I usually will say that.
Thanks for the talk. So I just had one question. So in economics, we don't just have the empirical tools, right, of statistics or modeling. We also have this sort of separate set of tools, these like models, more theoretical models that help us reason deductively about what would happen if supply goes up or demand goes down, or if we increase minimum wage, will unemployment increase as well? And sometimes, like if you do the empirical research, it may end up contradicting these deductive reasoning models, right? And so maybe you find that unemployment actually doesn't increase. And so, like, in bridging that gap between sort of research and policy, how do you deal with the fact that this discrepancy might exist? And then how do you reason about which one's wrong? Is it the deductive reasoning, or is it some flaw in the empirical research?
Well, usually the deductive reason is like, here are the assumptions that, that yield, perfect information and, all this stuff that never happens in real life. So, it's common to, you come up with your theory and you test your theory, and, your theory should stand up to the empirical evidence. Which one, oftentimes this cognitive bias is at play, where you say, well, that maybe either the theoretical researcher thinks that the empirical evidence is bad, and the empirical researcher thinks that, the theories, it's a similar overlapping circles between the theoreticians and the empiricists. So I'm glad you brought up that point, because I don't think it's resolved in any way.
And then like a related issue is, right, then you have a lot of empirical studies that on the same topic that could end up contradicting each other with maybe no clear consensus, and policymakers could cherry pick. So did you ever run into that issue?
Yeah, I think there's a heated debate about the penalty for rehospitalizations going on. Some of you might be aware of, where there's kind of contradictory findings, and the researchers are trying to resolve the contradictions because they know it's going to confuse the policymakers, and then no one's going to pay attention to the to the researchers anymore because they're saying different things, and then they, everyone, it's so I'm seeing that play out in real time in a really important issue. I don't know, it has yet to be resolved. So it's an example of it does have an impact. I mean, the policymakers are like, I thought you had a clear answer here. What are your researchers up up to? You're kind of telling us one thing, now you're telling us another, and you can't even decide what's true.
Thank you.
Okay, so Ruth Etzioni, thank you, Dan. And what I really loved about your talk is that it just generated a huge number of questions, and I'm sure it's going to generate conversation in the conference. And there's a relatively small number of us standing here asking questions, but I bet you a lot of people have questions. I hope you'll stick around, and we'll get to ask you. So I have a lot, but I just want to say one thing. I think I heard you say, suggest outsourcing the communication. Did you say something about let the media do it? Because
I think that my view is that everyone has a comparative advantage. I think of this pipeline like there's the theoretical researchers, like empirical researchers, like people that are more into communication, and then it kind of moves on down the line to application. Like, I don't think I'm asking the theoretical statistician to suddenly be out there communicating their research with the senator. I'm saying, if you're a theoretical statistician, make sure the applied researchers are kind of understanding where the application is, because it builds off each other. And if you're an applied researcher, get that application on down the line. I guess there's a very diverse audience here, and I don't think everybody necessarily, this message isn't aimed to everybody, but the message that's aimed to everybody is just take it that next step. And I think that I don't want to overstate.
It just touched a chord for me because, I've worked in overdiagnosis and cancer screening for a long time, and the media really did a disservice. And I don't think that we recognize necessarily the incentives of those intermediaries. They also have incentives. And so in taking the next step, I think that's something that we have to bear in mind.
And the outsourcing is like, like in-house staff of communications people, like within a university or something like that. I'm not necessarily saying like outsource it to the lobbyist.
Is that we at Fred Hutch have an active media group, and I think it really is worthwhile for statisticians to cultivate relationships with those reporters because they want to communicate the science. And so that can be very fruitful.
Thanks, Ruth. Anirban Basu, University of Washington. Great talk, Dan. I had a question about the gap that you were talking about between numbers and evidence. It seems to me that the gap is only relevant if it leads to decision errors. And I wonder how much do policymakers think about decision errors, or to what extent they feel accountable for decision errors? And if they're not, what could be done to overcome that?
I love the question. I don't have anything to add. I saw Anirban here. I'm like, oh, he's going to come up with something good. Yeah. I think it's something to explore. I guess that sometimes, evidence is used, in the wrong situation for the right cause. At some point, it's out in the ether and people use it for what they use it for. And I think what happens is that, I guess what worries me is, and you see this kind of in the recent political environment, is that it's hard to know what's real anymore. So I think even if it has a small, it might serve a purpose in the short term, the longer term consequences might end up being negative. It's kind of, what's science, what's fact? But that's, I think, for a different conference, different talk.
So let's thank Dan again for excellent talk.